Good morning and welcome to our asynchronous online class. We're kicking off our material today by talking about some introduction to democracy and peace. Overall, we're going to start to look at how regimes have developed and changed over time and whether or not the type of regime of a country affects international politics. As you can imagine, our realists argue that democracy doesn't matter, that really all international politics is about power. But our liberals argue that democracy is one of the three cornerstones for creating a more peaceful world, alongside with free trade and international institutions. Our constructivists, as they often do, say democracy can matter, it just depends. So to get us started in thinking about this topic, I have a couple of maps up on the screen. The first one is from Freedom House, which I've included a link so you can go and explore this interactive map. But overall, this identifies which countries are considered free, which are any of the countries in the green. Those that are partly free, meaning that they have some civil and political liberties, but not all. And that's that group is in the purple. And those in the orange are those that are not free. These are our pure dictatorships. Today, about 83 countries are classified as being free, 63 partly free, and 56 are not free. However, if you look at the most recent PDF from Freedom House, so they don't have a map for this year, we've seen the number of partly free countries decline to 56 and not free increase to 56. So this provides an interesting trend where we do see a lot of democracies around the world, and yet we're starting to notice a very disturbing pattern in the last 10 or 15 years, which is that democracies are not stable, and many will start to slide back towards authoritarianism. The map off to the right therefore shows the state of democracies overall. As you can see, there is quite a range of variation. Okay. There are a few different objectives we have in this section. First is that you should get very comfortable with identifying what makes a regime democratic versus autocratic, aka authoritarian. You should also be able to talk about the process of democratization, especially the two major components, which are initiation and consolidation. As part of this, you should talk about what are the common explanations. Why do we think democratization starts? And why some countries become stable democracies and others don't. Last, you should be able to talk about some major historical trends in democratization and pinpoint ways in which global forces are shaping democracy. Okay, so let's start by talking about our different regime types, which can be put into two categories, democracy or autocracy. And if you think back to our definition of regimes, these are systems. They are collections of rules, laws, and organizations or institutions that pass policy. In this case, we're talking about domestic policies, domestic governments, domestic regimes. So democracies are overall marked by the rule of the people, aka popular sovereignty. People are able to choose from among an array of candidates, and they have rights to participate in the system. So they can express what policies they support and also express their lack of support for certain policies. But outside of this, democracies can really vary. On the one hand, you have a set of electoral democracies, which are democracies that basically have elections and nothing else. So the people can express themselves, they can vote in new leaders, but their participation is just limited to elections. However, as you can see from the definition, these elections are free, fair, and competitive, meaning that there are multi-parties running for power. So when people go to the polls, they don't just have the option to vote for the current state leaders. Instead, they could choose from at least two different parties. So an electoral democracy has 2+ parties. Those parties express different beliefs, and they each have a legitimate shot at winning the election. There are no rules that block certain belief systems from participating. So you might have a liberal and a conservative party, or several liberal parties and several conservative parties. And they each have a shot at winning the election. There's no rules preventing a socialist party from running or from preventing a religious party from running. All have the chance to participate. So, a good example of electoral democracy is Poland. Poland in the early 1990s was able to become an independent state from the Soviet Union, and they held their first elections in 1991. These were free, fair, multi-party elections. People of Poland could vote for representatives that would pursue the policies they supported. However, it's not a democracy like we often think. There was no freedom of speech yet. There was no academic freedom. So what a researcher was studying could be punished. And they weren't transparent. The government of Poland did still censor information during this time. So this is where you see the difference with liberal democracies. Liberal democracies have free, fair, competitive elections, but they also protect all other sorts of political and civil liberties. So in addition to free and fair elections, they also protect freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association or the ability to form groups, freedom of the press. There's usually a judicial process to protect those accused of committing a crime. Often there are rights over privacy and rights of minorities. So liberal democracies are what you see in Western Europe, the United States, Canada, among a number of others. These differ from your autocracy, which you could also think of as authoritarian states. Here, power is centralized to the leadership. Leaders are appointed or gain power through violence, and opposing voices are suppressed. There are restrictions on contestation and participation. But like democracies, there are different types of autocracies. You have closed autocracies. These ones do not even attempt to give the image of being democratic. There are no multi-party elections. You either have a hereditary state where power is passed from one family member to the next, or you have one party that can only be voted on in an election. So it's a single party election. Good examples are Saudi Arabia. They're a monarchy. Elections are very rare. Instead, power is passed from bloodlines, from fathers to sons. China has a single party at the federal level, the Chinese Communist Party. They control the 8 other parties that run in elections. So in practice, there's really only one party, one voice. We then have our electoral autocracies. These are still authoritarian countries. Power rests in the hands of a single person or a small group, but they do allow the public to participate in very small ways, very limited ways. So in Iran, as we talked about in the past, the public can't vote for the supreme leader, cannot vote for the supreme leader, but they can elect the president, who's been chosen from a small list, pre-approved by the supreme leader. So Iran can elect their president from a short list, and they can also elect members of the legislature. In Russia, the elections occur, but they are not fair. There are many cases where the results of the election are not accurate or are rigged. And oftentimes the leader, which in recent years is Vladimir Putin, has a lot of control over the system. Venezuela works in a very similar way. They have elections within Venezuela, but in practice, the leaders are handpicked. So you have Hugo Chavez, who rules until 2013. He then hand-selects who he wants to be his successor, which is Nicolas Maduro. And then the elections that we see right after are not free and fair, and Maduro wins. And even though there was strong opposition, the central government suppresses the voice of the people. Okay, now that we have our basic definitions in place, let's look at a brief history of regime change. Overall, what you can see from this map and this chart is that the world has become more democratic. Compared to the 17 and 1800s, there are far more democracies than there used to be. This means that there are more elections being held, more people with political freedoms and rights, and a lot more representation of people. But when you actually look further into this chart, we can see that it's not consistent. There hasn't been a singular consistent decline in autocracies, and there's been kind of waves of democratization. This idea of waves comes from Samuel Huntington, who we've talked about in the past. Huntington argues that when you look across time, that you see these time periods where a whole bunch of countries democratized for similar reasons, and then you see a little bit of a reversal, where there's a backlash against democracy and the rise of more dictatorships. However, you then see another wave of democratization, and overall there's an increase, but it's a wavy increase of increases and declines. First wave you can't quite see fully on this chart. First wave of democratization begins in 1828, and it's really inspired and motivated by a few earlier points of democratization, specifically the American and French Revolutions. Between 1828 and 1926, we have a number of countries become very stable democracies, including Finland, Iceland, Switzerland, France, and the United Kingdom. These countries also notably are today high and middle income countries. That being said, we do see a reversal right after World War I. Much of this is due to the fact that we have the rise of fascism in Germany, Italy, and Stalinist Russia. Second wave begins after World War II and the defeat of many of these fascist states. So, between 1943 and 1962, we have our former fascist states going through democratization. This would be like Germany and Italy. We have a number of states in Latin America starting to democratize. And we also have this wave of decolonization, where the British and the French slowly lose their empires, such as in Algeria and Cyprus. So, in those former territories, we do find most of those states chose to democratize. However, this period of democratization was also short-lived, and as you're heading into the 1960s, you see a reversal, where many military coups occur, and we see the rise of military and one-party rule, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. Third wave starts in the mid-1970s. This is the final wave that Huntington discussed. This occurs for a few reasons. One is that a number of major power dictatorships in Southern Europe democratized, including Spain, Portugal, and Greece. But we also had a number of reversals again in Latin America, where the military roles were defeated and democratization happened once again. So this would be places like Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. Third wave of democratization also includes the breakup of the Soviet Union, where former Soviet states, in trying to separate themselves from what was the Soviet Union, also democratized. So you have a massive spike in democratization after 1990. You can see it on this chart, on this chart. So as you're heading to the point of 2000, you actually see a switch where there are more democracies than autocracies in the world. However, there was one problem with Samuel Huntington's research, which is that his measurement of democracy, so how he defined a democracy, was really minimal and mostly based off of elections and basic participation. So if you look more into our liberal full democracies, then what we find is that this trend is a lot flatter. It's not as wavy, it's not as much of a spike. once you start including other civil and political liberties. Nevertheless, we do see democracies have increased over the number of autocracies. Now, there's one pattern at the very end of this chart I also want to highlight, which is that now you're starting to see democratization stall as we're heading towards 2018. You aren't seeing a lot of new democracies develop, and you're not seeing autocracy start to decline. And this is largely due to a few factors. In democracies, we start to see the rise of populist and nationalist movements, those with strong love of country and which are based on kind of the will of the people. And many of these populist movements have had some authoritarian tendencies. They want to give power to individuals who are seen as strong, especially strong on the economy. And so this has either stopped or prevented further democratization. In autocracies, they've also been surprisingly stable. We haven't seen the decline much further, in large part because we see the number of electoral autocracies increase, which again are those dictatorships that have some elections. And so those elections have given a little bit of a voice to the people and may have actually satisfied or appeased pro-democracy movements. So where we're at right now is trying to understand these trends. Why have we seen countries democratize but others haven't? And then why have so many countries kind of stalled in the democratization process? Why haven't we seen the further development of liberal democracies? Okay, so now we know a little bit about how many states have democratized and what are the trends and patterns. Let's talk a little bit more about the process of democratization. And for today's class, we're really going to focus on the first of these two steps. Overall, though, there are two phases states go through as they're democratizing. First is democratic initiation. This is where a state begins the process of democratizing. So it begins the process of starting up rules and institutions for participation, like elections, or allowing peaceful protesters. So in democratic initiation, there are either one event or usually more like a series of events that move states from being run by a dictator to having space to create democratic institutions. So this means there's a series of events where a country gets rid of its dictatorship, whether it's electoral or closed, and that provides space for the new democracy to be set up. So for example, if we look at Tunisia, Tunisia was where the Arab Spring started. Democratic initiation began when the former president, President Ben Ali, stepped down. In his case, he was really president in name only because this was an electoral dictatorship. He wasn't elected through competitive elections. So when Ben Ali steps down, that created the space for the new democracy to start being set up. The second phase is democratic consolidation. This is where democracy starts to become more stable and where the institutions become ingrained in society. This means that people on the ground accept that democracy is the new form of government and they start to participate. They participate in elections, for instance. Once the majority of the public has accepted the new democracy and its rules and values and norms, then we usually consider that country to have been consolidated. If a country is continuing to slip back and forth, so maybe it takes a few steps towards being democratic and then democracy reverses some, then it hasn't yet reached the end of consolidation. So now that we've talked a little bit about both steps, let's talk more about what types of events, what types of processes start democratic initiation. Let's begin our discussion about democratic initiation by looking back at our two big perspectives,
the inside-out perspective, which looks at countries using comparative politics, so looking within the country and seeing what makes a country different from the domestic politics of other countries. The other is the outside-in perspective, which looks at how international affairs can affect a domestic process. So if we start with the inside-out perspective, one of the main reasons states start democratizing is that certain states develop very strong social movements, which are collections of individual people like you and I, networks, and non-governmental organizations that together work to create change. And in particular, these social movements are pushing the domestic government to start democratizing. So these social movements attempt to get a number of goals met. Oftentimes they are doing things like demanding really large changes, so demanding the end of the dictatorship. But the social movements could also break democratization into pieces. So many of the social movements may start by just protesting corruption or protesting fraud in elections, with the hope that if they start with one small area, that it will ripple into demanding bigger changes, like the end of the dictatorship. So to take Italy for an example, Italy democratized in 1946, right after World War II. The way that democratization started in Italy is that you had a growing social movement to encourage a transition from the monarchy into a liberal democracy. So the social movement had a variety of actors within it. You had peaceful protesters and groups protesting the old monarchy. These groups included religious groups and labor parties, so unions, for instance. You also had charity groups that were working for the rights of women and children. They also assisted in these protests against the government. There were also those who used violence as part of the larger social movement. You had riots and mobs attacking government buildings, demanding change. By 1946, the government decides that they will hold a referendum where the people can vote whether or not the monarchy stays or goes. And the public voted to democratize. Let's switch over then to the outside-in perspective. Here we're looking at how actions outside of the country lead the country to change from within. So one outside factor is democracy promotion. This is where governments around the world encourage another country to start transitioning. This could be through diplomacy, it could be through mediation, or it could be through shaming. So they could try to argue their case that the country would be more ethical, more moral, better protector of human rights if they democratize. Some countries will go a step further and they will tie financial aid to democratization, which is a policy known as aid conditionality. In this policy, the government promises to provide money that the government might need in exchange for small movements towards democracy. So they might provide aid if there are protections on the press, or aid if rights for women are improved. The idea is that they're basically using leverage. We will give you something you want if you take steps towards democratization. Now you might be wondering, why do outside states care? Why bother promoting democracy? The big answer comes from liberalism, which is the democratic peace theory. Our liberals argue that no liberal democracy has ever fought another, and therefore states are safer when other countries become democratic. This was a large part of the War on Terror, in fact, which was conducted by the US. We believed if countries like Iraq and Afghanistan became democratic, then terrorism would not find a home there. The people would have a place to vote and wouldn't turn to violence. So many democracies around the world are interested in investing in liberal democracy because they think it will make them safer. The final outside factor is democracy diffusion, which diffusion is the spread from one area to another. Under this belief, when actors see another country democratize, then people in their country feel inspired by those actions and they want it for themselves. They also can copy what one state actor did well into their own country. So you can think of democracy diffusion as a form of copycat behavior. If one activity worked in one country, well, maybe we can do the same thing and replicate the process in our country. Let's take an example, because oftentimes democratic initiation doesn't just start with one factor, but you may see several factors at play. And in the case of Egypt, you see both democracy diffusion and democracy promotion. Our story with Egypt begins where many of ours do, which is the beginning of the Arab Spring. In December of 2010, this pro-democracy movement was set off when a man in Tunisia set himself on fire, aka engaged in self-immolation. He did so to protest government corruption in Tunisia. President Ben Ali had been in power for decades. And under his rule, it was very difficult for the average person to run a business. There were a lot of fines and bribes that many in the government would expect from street vendors in order for them to operate their business. So what had happened to this man in Tunisia is he had once again had his cart, because he sold fruit, he had his cart taken from him and his scales and his equipment because he was unwilling or unable to pay a bribe to the local police. So in desperation and despair, he set himself on fire. The video of this went viral, and people throughout the region start talking about all of the domestic problems they were facing, because many of these countries struggled with economic problems like poverty and high unemployment rates. And many people had experienced the same type of corruption. So we suddenly see mass protests erupt in Tunisia. And just a few weeks later in January, specifically January 15th, Ben Ali resigns. He steps down in the face of all of these growing protests. Now to come back to Egypt, the Egyptian public was watching what was going on in Tunisia. And so we first see democratic diffusion. In fact, there are events that occur that directly copy the activities in Tunisia. First, you start to see protests starting to grow in January, small protests at first. And then on January 17th, an Egyptian man engages in self-immolation in front of the parliament building. So he sets himself on fire, just like the vendor in Tunisia. Excellent example of diffusion, where not only were they inspired, but some people copied the techniques of those in Tunisia. This started to a widespread protest movement in Egypt. And on January 25th, so just 8 days later, you have growing waves of protesters. You can see them in especially the bottom right, that are calling for Hosni Mubarak, the leader of Egypt, to step down. Much like Ben Ali, Hosni Mubarak amazingly won every election because there was not competitive, free and fair elections in Egypt. Egypt was a dictatorship. So the main rallying cry of the January 5th movement, so you have the development of a social movement because of diffusion, was bread, social justice, and freedom. So they're focused on economic reforms as well as political reforms. Then on February 1st, you have democracy promotion from outside the country. Specifically, President Obama tells Hosni Mubarak that he must transition, he must grant political rights and freedoms to the people, or the United States will withhold aid. And this was fairly significant because the U.S. is one of the primary donors to Egypt, one of their big aid allies. So this was a serious threat issued by the Obama administration, and a great example of aid conditionality. By February 11th, the protests from inside the country, as well as the outside pressure, led Hosni Mubarak to resign on February 11th. So, great example of democratic initiation. You first have democratic diffusion, where those in Egypt are inspired by outside events, by those in Tunisia, and they start to copy their techniques and activities. You then see the development of a social movement that is domestic, that has its own set of actors rallying to push for democracy. You have the January 25th movement, which is what they called this case. And then you have democracy promotion from outside. Good, so at this point we have finished talking about the first phase of democratization. After today's lessons, you know more clearly about the different types of democracies and the different types of dictatorships or autocracies. We also talked a bit about how democratization has spread, that it's moved in potentially waves, although it's flattened out in recent years. And we've talked about the factors that lead a state to start democratizing. Now, however, comes a very difficult stage, which is whether or not a country stabilizes, whether the democracy holds and doesn't slide back into dictatorship. So I have one question for you to reflect on for Wednesday's class, which is, what are some factors that increase the chances a democracy stabilizes? What factors increase the likelihood a democracy consolidates? And then 2, think about some questions you have from this material, and we will address those when we come back together on Wednesday.